Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out, and thanks to U of T for hosting us for a panel on opportunities, risks, and challenges developing RNG projects in North America. My name is Kris Hornburg. I'm the moderator for this panel, and I'm to have the easiest job just kind of introducing our panel, and I'll be talking just very briefly on some key facts for RNG, or renewable natural gas. The hope kind of is to have this be interactive. So if you guys have any questions, it's not that large of an audience. So if you have any questions, we do have some cue cards that you guys can write stuff down on. And we have some people in the audience that can run them up here, and then hopefully you can ask questions, or feel free to put your hand up and ask questions that way. We have an hour and a half total. And I think the presenters will take anywhere from about 7 to 15 minutes, anywhere in there. So we'll have the vast majority open for hopefully open discussion. So anyway, nothing's off the table. And I have a couple of questions that I can ask as well to try to kickstart the conversation a little bit. So going on from there, we have 3 people on the panel. So first I want to introduce Gidda. Gidda has over 15 years of experience in consulting, and he kind of specializes in transformational changes occurring in waste management. And I've worked with Tej closely a lot. He's been an advisor on renewable natural gas, climate change, when cap and trade was still happening in Ontario. So, and some of the slides will speak to that. Moving on, we have Robert Dysiewicz. Robert Dysiewicz is the Senior Manager of Renewable Natural Gas and Business Development at Enbridge Gas. Again, Rob has been on this project with the City of Toronto and GHD from the beginning. He's kind of responsible for the development of clean fueling and alternative energy technologies. Rob and his team work closely with Ontario businesses and municipalities in assisting them with the development of these and other clean technologies. And then lastly, but not least, we have Carlyle. So Carlyle is the Director of Infrastructure and Resource Management for the City of Toronto. I used to work for Carlyle, so it's always a great pleasure to moderate a panel in which your former boss now sits, because I can kind of say whatever I want to him. But anyway, Carlyle's been, again, on this renewable natural gas project from the beginning, along with Tej and Rob, and he's been really driving renewable natural gas home to the City of Toronto, which was a bit of a struggle in and of itself, considering we moved away from combined heat and power to move to renewable natural gas. So that's something I hope he talks about. That's kind of all I got. So we're going to start with Tej, I think, is going up first, and the floor is all yours. Oh, sorry, my mistake. Key facts about renewable natural gas. I was supposed to have a couple of them. So I just want to, it says it all there, but some of the things when I came up with these, I like them because they also stood out to me. So renewable natural gas is the lowest carbon fuel that is commercially available in existence today, and I'm including electricity in that mix. So that means that a vehicle, especially a heavy-duty vehicle fueled with renewable natural gas, has less of an emissions profile than an electric vehicle does. So I think that's an important distinction, because a lot of people would just assume that's not true. The reason they assume that's not true is because when you think about natural gas, there's still an emission that comes from the tailpipe. However, emissions from the tailpipe make up the vast minority of actual emissions when we're talking about vehicle fueling. Most of it is actually from upstream emissions, the mining, the refining, and the transportation. So that's why you actually get a lower carbon output than you do for, when you're using RNG than you do from electricity. You can displace natural gas as opposed to electricity. So it's also a better use of the fuel. It's a higher value commodity. And you can use the existing pipelines. And that's something that I'm sure Rob will speak to. There's no new infrastructure needed to move renewable natural gas across the country, and in fact, across North America. So that's a super convenient way of using the fuel. And it's also, it means that you don't have to build massive new infrastructure projects in order to be able to efficiently utilize it. But even, there's a lot of talk about moving natural gas up as opposed to using diesel fuel in more remote northern communities. RNG, because it can be produced at source, could be a way of kind of overcoming some of those challenges. And lastly, just from a value proposition, the electricity, like the FIT programs in Ontario, were canceled. So that, the writing was on the wall and with the previous Liberal government over some of those things. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Tej, but I think biomass was one of the more expensive ways of generating renewable electricity. So it was going to be one of the first to get cut. So from that perspective, RNG is a much higher value commodity. So just moving away from the emission side, it allows municipalities to actually generate far more revenue, which then can be used to fund future green projects. And again, Carlyle will speak about that and some of the strategy we've done moving through council and getting our permissions that way. And now actually, I will step aside and let the panel.
Thank you, Kris. Hopefully everyone can hear. Yeah, so I'm Tej and I'm from a consulting company called GHD. I happen to know my two fellow panelists quite well, and I think you'll see as we go through today that I'm far more intelligent and charming than either of them.
That's true.
So I am so interesting that, you know, I work in the solid waste space or the waste management space, and the waste management space has a place to play and a significant place to play with respect to climate change. So a couple of quick blurbs about that. You'll kind of see up there. Actually, I'll walk over and point out to it. So this is a landfill. So I think everyone knows what a landfill is. It's deposition of waste and then engineered systems and features to control liquids and gases and groundwater from being harmed or polluted in any way. I came into the industry about 15 years ago. It's actually 15 years that I've been in the space almost to the month, so which is kind of interesting. When I first got into the industry, it was a lot about how to design landfills, how to control water and gases from landfills. And that was really the primary thing that we were working on as a consulting company. People would hire us to design their landfills and their gas extraction systems and things of that nature. What I find really interesting from a big picture perspective is that the waste management industry, especially in Ontario, but also in other parts of Canada and North America, have very radically shifted over years. So in the past, and you know, we would pretty much deposit everything into landfills other than what you put in your blue box, which is your recyclable material. Now I think we're pretty used to this concept of having another bin at the end of the curb that is our green bin. The City of Toronto has a green bin system, as Carlyle will talk about a little bit, and actually doing something with those organics rather than putting them into a landfill. And the natural consequence of that is that when those organics were going into a landfill, they were degrading and they were producing landfill gas. And landfill gas is about 50 to 60% methane. And when that gas is being produced, some of it will escape into the atmosphere. And methane, as we know, is a fairly significant greenhouse gas. I believe landfills as a whole are the #1 anthropogenic or man-made source of methane emission to the atmosphere. And, you know, one of the things I got into when I first started with the company is designing control systems to collect that methane before it goes out into the atmosphere. And I will say, as good as a designer we might be, as good as we think we are at our job, it's not possible to get it all. You're never going to be 100% efficient at collecting all that gas from the landfill environment. So the shift, there has been a shift, and it's been pretty transformative, and it continues to happen. Carlyle's going to talk more in specific about this, and Rob will create an overlay from the Enbridge side. But we went and shifted from the landfills to other types of solid waste facilities like this one in the middle. This is the City of Toronto's Disco Road Organics Processing Facility. So green bin material from the City of Toronto does not go to the landfill. It goes into a plant like that, and which the city owns and is in control of, and that they built and that went into service back in 2014. So now, instead of the hole in the ground where you have the problems controlling, containing methane as a greenhouse gas, you're putting that green bin material through a facility that will access all the organic matter and degrade it into methane that you can fully capture and fully control and convert into an energy source. So to my knowledge, the city is the leader. And I work all across North America, so I'll say the city is the leader at the municipal level in deploying technology of this kind to prevent organics from going into landfill. So that's really the shift. And I think it's an interesting shift that continues to occur. Ontario is the leader in anaerobic digestion of organics. This is the technology we're talking about, anaerobic digestion. So same process that occurs in a landfill, but in one of these facilities is accelerated and controlled, and all the gases are captured. So this technology is spreading throughout North America now. A couple of examples. British Columbia, as a province, has a ban on putting organic matter into landfills, primarily, again, driven by the climate change file. Quebec has recently implemented a ban. Ontario will eventually implement a ban. I think it's 2022 that ban would notionally come into place. The state of California, a place that I work quite a bit, is a 40 million person environment. So California as a state is bigger than Canada is as a country and has a substantially larger GDP by probably about 50%. California, as of 2 years ago, implemented regulation to say that if you produce more than 8 cubic yards of organic waste per week, I don't really know what a cubic yard is. I think it's something like this big. But if you generate more than 8 of those in a given week, as a grocery store or a food processor or even a restaurant, you can't put that organic matter into a landfill anymore. You have to divert it. So California is now in the process of building significant infrastructure, similar to what you see in the middle picture over there, to process tens of millions of tons of organic matter that otherwise would have gone into immense, very large landfills that exist in the California environment. So we're seeing that shift all across North America now. What's really interesting is this shift occurred in Europe a long time ago. There are numerous of these facilities in Europe that are generating this biogas that is then being used for a specific purpose. Okay. So I think from a climate change perspective, I don't think it's worth sort of litigating this in large part. I think there's really no real doubt from a scientific consensus that this is happening. It is affecting almost everything, terrestrial ecosystems and ocean aquatic systems, all of it. I think the scientific consensus is so profound on this that it's just a matter of record now, and it's a matter of how we deal with it. So a couple of facts you've probably all seen before. CO2 emissions would have to decline by 45% before 2030 just to keep the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You've probably all seen some of the curves about what CO2 concentrations are actually doing. They're exceeding this and going up fairly exponentially. They're not on a decline that would support keeping temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is the environmental challenge of our time, in my opinion. Working for a consulting firm that does environmental work, this is a huge, huge issue that will require multiple solutions to address. I think the sector I work in waste management is sort of one of the areas that can improve in terms of helping deal with this. Again, go back to methane being released into the atmosphere. So renewable energy will need to supply 70 to 80% of power by 2050. That's a huge goal. That's a really, really tough goal. Ontario has actually done a fairly good job at that. We don't have coal-fired electricity power plants anymore on our grid here. So they've all faded away. All 6 of them have been shut down. We primarily have a mix of nuclear power, hydropower, and a rather large and increasing number of renewables. But not everyone has done that. I think of Alberta. Alberta has a very dirty electricity grid because they continue to consume a lot of fossil fuels as part of their electricity spectrum. So getting to this 70 to 80% of power, that's going to be difficult. I will say I took my family down to Costa Rica earlier this year, which if anyone has not been there, go there. It's a beautiful place. They ran for 1 month, I believe last year, on 100% renewable energy, primarily wind. They also have geothermal off their volcanoes, of all things, and lots of solar. So I think if a country like Costa Rica can do something like that, I think it's completely achievable. There are issues in managing a grid in terms of how that electricity supply is created because it's a little bit variable. But I think those are all things that can be overcome by technology. And Costa Rica has already shown that you can do that. So it's possible, but it requires a lot of investment. So the temperature carbon dioxide curve, you've probably all seen this, and the best fit line going through that about increasing CO2 concentrations. I think, again, there's no real doubt that that is an increasing trend. We are taking more thermogenic sources of carbon dioxide and putting them into the atmosphere. So we're talking about renewable natural gas today. So one of the things I want to point out about how renewable natural gas interrupts or disrupts this cycle is this. For the most part, when we talk about natural gas, as Rob will discuss as well, we're talking about methane. Natural gas is methane. We're extracting it from fossil deposits, thermogenic deposits. We're bringing it up to the surface of the earth. It then becomes combusted, and that creates a new source of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. I would say, as Kris mentioned, that it's still much cleaner than almost any other of the fuels that are out there, but it still provides a new form of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and contributes to the accumulation that we see here to some degree, although there are many, many larger sources. When we talk about renewable natural gas, what we're saying is that, for instance, food waste, which is what we're talking about here, the City of Toronto has a facility that Enbridge is a part of that is going to convert food waste ultimately into the natural gas that goes into our furnaces and our boilers in our homes and in our factories and industries. What we're doing by achieving that is we're disrupting the thermogenic cycle, because food and food waste is grown at the surface of the earth and presumably sequesters carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to grow and from terrestrial systems. And all we're talking about here is then taking that food waste, putting it into a facility, anaerobically digesting it, and creating renewable natural gas from that, that then goes into our distribution system to displace fossil fuel-based natural gas. That's the disruption. It's part of what we call the biogenic cycle and the loop for carbon that doesn't introduce new carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You're just reintroducing the carbon dioxide used to make the food in the first place. That's the theory. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's the disruption on this curve. So two parts to this. Obviously, there's the mitigation piece on climate change, and then there's the adaptation part on climate change to respond to the impacts or prevent climate change in the first piece. And I think in the first place, and I think what we're talking about in terms of renewable natural gas fits in that first part. This is how we go about converting resources and infrastructure around North America and the world, hopefully, in terms of preventing this in the first place, and again, disrupting that carbon cycle. We did in Ontario, for some of you will remember this, we did actually have a provincial mechanism to deal with this. And if you guys recall, we had something called cap and trade legislation. And you've seen probably cap and trade as a market force around the world in various locations. California has this, Quebec has this. Ontario did have this until the government overturned. And one of the first actions of the provincial government was to cancel cap and trade. But the concept is still viable, it's still out there, and it was very simple. It was a very, very simple concept, and I'm just going to quickly go through it. So the way it worked is you would have a number of big, heavy emitters of carbon dioxide spewing a plume of, in this case, carbon into the atmosphere. And what essentially was going to happen is each one of those emitters, we're going to get a red line and say, this is your obligation to reduce. You must take that plume and reduce it down to that level. So the question then became, how do you do that? Because a big natural gas power plant or a cement plant or a steel plant isn't necessarily going to be able to scrub all that CO2 out before they emit it into the atmosphere. It would be proportionally extremely expensive for them to produce that change, and possibly technologically not really possible. So the market, the cap and trade system, was set up to work in the middle and to allow people, for instance, another institution or emitter of greenhouse gases who is able to reduce, to then take that delta or that balance, which is sort of this part here, and sell it to them. They were selling the emission reduction they achieved to the entity that couldn't achieve that emission reduction themselves. They would have to, the emitter A would then have to pay for that, and that's how you achieve compliance. Under the concept that when you talk about climate change, we're not talking about a localized effect. This isn't smog or air pollution. Climate change and greenhouse gases are a global phenomenon. Does it really matter where the emission reduction is taking place as long as it takes place? Was the concept behind cap and trade. there are other parts to it. They're very interesting. If you look at the top right there, you see AD, that's an anaerobic digester, which is what we're talking about today. You see cows and the ability to reduce emissions from livestock and ozone. It was also possible for anyone who had an idea and the ability to create infrastructure to reduce emissions to simply build that infrastructure, prove that they were reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then also sell that compliance band or that achievement to regulated emitter A. So it was meant as a system to sponsor people to build green infrastructure to supply greenhouse gas emissions reductions to regulated emitter A, who couldn't do it by themselves. That was a second really important mechanism that was going to be sponsored by the system, usually in the form of greenhouse gas credits, which you've all probably heard about. So those guys would be selling those credits to regulated emitter A. The other way that this was intended to work was to have the top green line there, sale of government allowances. So if regulated emitter A couldn't buy enough credits from the open market to achieve their red line, they would simply buy the rest of their compliance from the government. So the intent of that was to then take money, give it to the government to achieve full compliance, to get to their red line, and the government, the Ontario government in this case, would then take that money and use it to deploy green infrastructure in Ontario. That was the other part of this, again, under the assumption that emitter A couldn't do that. So interesting system. It's a market-driven greenhouse gas system. It's in place all over the world in many various jurisdictions in different ways, but no longer in Ontario. But that was the intent. Sponsor the growth of green infrastructure, which is exactly the type of infrastructure we're talking about today, renewable natural gas. Now, obviously the city has continued with their program, despite the fact that one of the financial motivators that can help projects like this is now gone. So to me, the city is a champion and a leader in this industry. Enbridge has stepped up and is a part of this as well. So this green infrastructure that we're talking about and that we badly need if we're going to fight climate change is still being developed, despite the fact that from a provincial government standpoint, there's not a lot of support for it right now. You need champions in order to do this. So we've got a couple standing at the table today. So waste, again, is interesting. There's so many parts of the waste management sector that contribute to greenhouse gases. All of them have an impact. I think actually a couple of the really interesting ones I like to talk about are recycling. So we've probably all heard about what's going on with recycling right now. A lot of the material that goes into the blue box isn't necessarily finding its way back into reuse systems, largely in part because China has said, look, we don't want your material if it's contaminated anymore. It has to hit a certain purity for us to accept it, and that's caused a real problem for reutilizing those materials in local industry. But if you think about it, for every ton of material that you recycle, like plastics, that you put into that blue box that comes into the system, if that can be used to displace the production of virgin material, new plastic, that is a significant greenhouse gas saving as well. Right. So the impetus and the importance of recycling is still there, even though right now the markets aren't as clear as I think we all wish they would be. Back to anaerobic digestion and landfills, and I'm going to hand it over to Rob in 2 seconds after this. The other transformational shift that has occurred in places like Ontario is this. There was a time when we worked, and we did extract landfill gas out of the landfill, which is methane. We did extract gas from wastewater treatment plants, the anaerobic digesters there. And primarily what we did with that is we made electricity. That's not hard. All you need is a modified diesel engine. You need to do some preconditioning of the gas, but you basically put the gas through the engine and you will make renewable electricity. As Kris mentioned, the impetus to do that now in Ontario is gone because we don't have these so-called feed-in tariffs anymore. So very few people in Ontario are going to take biogas and make renewable electricity anymore. And plus, our carbon grid here in Ontario anyway is relatively clean now. So what is the benefit of putting additional renewable electricity into a grid that's already fairly carbon clean? That is the question. And if that's the question, the follow-up is, Well, what do you do with the biogas? So picture the natural gas distribution grid owned and operated by Enbridge. That is transmitting natural gas to all of us. That's how we power our furnaces. What if you could, instead of making electricity with this biogas, convert it to that same product and make it chemically indistinguishable? What if it's the same product with the same heating value and you're pumping it in through a renewable source? That is a significant value from a carbon standpoint because you are displacing a fossil fuel, something that is 100% a fossil fuel for the most part. So that is the shift that we've seen in the industry. There are renewable natural gas projects similar to what we're about to talk about today all over North America right now. And they're primarily being pushed by entities like Enbridge, other gas distributors. The other day, UPS, I'm sure we all know who UPS is. It's the courier with the brown trucks. This wasn't the other day, this was a little while ago. They came out with a request for buying renewable natural gas. And the reason they did that is because they run a lot of those brown courier vehicles on compressed natural gas. They run it on natural gas. So what they want to do is green their transportation fleet that is all over the road and that delivers packages to our homes. So that is really pushing the market towards renewable natural gas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob, and he's going to go into the Enbridge perspective on this.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here this morning. I will say this, I am definitely the least intelligent out of this group, and no one can accuse me of being charming, so you've pegged that pretty accurately, Tej. Thank you for the reminder. So maybe I'll begin with this. The good doctor, we affectionately call Tej, is definitely an expert in this field. I'm always amused and impressed just by his vast knowledge that you probably just got a little glimpse into today. Certainly, as an individual, he's a leader globally in North America, and he leads a company that probably is perceived as one of the foremost authorities in this field as GHD. So no doubt we are definitely exposed to greatness. Thank you, the good doctor. And beyond the good doctor is Carlyle and also a leader in his field. He's pretty humble about what he's done with the city, because if you think about the size of the city and the challenges that the city faces managing its organic programs and waste, Carlyle has been a visionary from the very beginning, recognizing the opportunity that's in front of us in the circular economy. And he has inspired us to think about true partnerships that I know he'll talk about in great detail. So we're pretty lucky to be in both of your presence. Thank you. So I will start a little bit about the partnership that Enbridge, or as previously known, Consumers Gas, the type of relationship that we've had with the city. It started over 170 years ago. And what is maybe, oh yeah, I do have slides. Awesome. So a relationship that has endured 170 years started between us as Consumers Gas becoming Toronto's lighting company. We made gas out of coke, and we transformed that gas to the streets and provided street lighting for the city. So we were initially, you could say, an electric lighting company. Over 170 years, we've transformed. Today, we provide the city with energy for its businesses, for homes, and for the buildings. And I think we're once again at a point in time where we're being asked to transform again. And that transformation, we're just the custodians of that transformation. I think many generations before us did the hard work. We're just continuing with this. And our generation is tasked with facing climate challenges that we talk about and we hear in the media quite often, and figuring out exactly how to leverage this great distribution system that is in place, billions of dollars invested in underground infrastructure that moves majority of the energy in Ontario. So our job is to basically figure out how do we take this distribution system and how do we leverage it to fight and combat climate change. So, you know, it's kind of odd that here's a gas utility person representing both Enbridge Inc. and Enbridge Gas Distribution talking about transformation to clean fuels. It's an odd place, or you would think it's an odd place, but hopefully by the time we're done here, you will feel a little bit differently about that. So I don't want to belabor this point, but in case you're wondering who Enbridge is in North America, well, we move liquids, so that's oil. You hear about us in the news about how much oil we distribute through the North American landscape, and it's quite a bit. Data is up in front of you there. Last year, we also acquired a Spectra Energy. Spectra Energy is the foremost natural gas distribution delivery entity in North America. So between the two, we're essentially a company that moves a lot of energy, liquid energy, as well as gaseous energy through North America. What is very little known about us, and probably something that we should talk about more often, is just how much renewable energy Enbridge moves throughout North America, actually beyond North America, Europe as well. We have some of the biggest investments in solar, wind, and now RNG, recognizing that our energy landscape is transforming, and along with that, so are we. So in Ontario, we deliver energy to 3.7 million customers, and we serve over 500 communities. This is what our distribution system looks like within North America. And the one that we will focus on today is specifically the gaseous portion of our distribution system, because that molecule that is produced here in Toronto or in Ontario can essentially be moved notionally anywhere in North America. So that clean molecule produced in Toronto can end up in California, it can end up in British Columbia, it can end up in your home. Doesn't matter where we choose to put this molecule. What's important is that it is displacing, as some of the previous speakers have said, it's displacing that fossil component that we currently move through the distribution system. And like Toronto, we're also very focused on safety. It pains all of us when we hear of incidents of either oil spill or gas pipeline incidents. It is something that all of us inside of the organization work very hard to avoid, and safety is our primary responsibility. And we spend a lot of money on safety and a lot of training, and it is something that guided us in our project as we move forward with Toronto on our first project. So now the reality. You know, when we talk about producing and distributing clean energy and transforming our world to a clean society, we cannot avoid the conversation about economics. It is not inexpensive to produce green energy, whether that's solar, wind, or in this case, renewable natural gas. So we have to evaluate the economic piece, certainly. And what I wanted to kind of put on your radar here is, what does it really mean? So for us to take biogas from a landfill or from an anaerobic digester or from wastewater treatment facility, it is producing biogas. So now, how much does it cost us to take that biogas and clean it so it can be injected into the pipeline? It probably contains about 50 to 60% methane. Our pipeline moves 98% methane. So we need to upgrade that gas. And that's the cost in front of you. So this is a number from Canadian Biogas Association. It's an average. Some projects are less, some projects are more. But in general, it's about $21 a GJ to produce renewable natural gas into the system. That includes upgrading it and injecting it into the grid. Coincidentally, $21 a GJ translates to about $75 per megawatt hour. And if you were to think about what we pay for electricity here in Ontario, which may be slightly expensive if you compare it across the North American landscape, that's off-peak. That's a blend between on and off-peak electricity today. So to let that sink in a little bit, we're able to produce 100% renewable fuel at the cost of our electric today. If we were to look at the cost of solar or wind, all of which are coming down in price, it is much higher than this. So we have a solution. It is a solution that is both economical, it is not hampered by technology, and we're proving it's doable today. So I won't spend a lot of time on this slide because I think Tej already touched on many of these opportunities. So it's landfill, wastewater treatment facilities, and anaerobic digester. Today, Carlyle will speak specifically about the AD project, So I won't talk too much about this, except one bullet point at the very bottom of this slide. So when we think about how much energy is delivered by natural gas in Ontario today, it is substantial in Ontario. If we were to only displace 6% of the amount of energy that is moved through our pipeline system today, that's equivalent to one Pickering nuclear facility. So when we talk about 100% electrification of our society, we need to talk about generation. How do we make that electricity? And we need to talk about how we transform that electricity, transport that electricity from source to us. And if 6% is one nuclear Pickering facility, how do we displace 12%? Or 30% or 80% as it is envisioned? That is absolutely the fundamental challenge that we all face, and the next generation that is probably studying here today will face moving forward. It's a significant challenge, and one that has to consider the fact that as ratepayers in Ontario, we have all paid into billions of dollars into a gas distribution system. Stranding those assets would make our province, first of all, we would not be competitive, because to locate businesses here and to live here, we need to provide relatively inexpensive energy. So we have to be mindful of coming up with ways to utilize the existing distribution systems to allow us to transform to clean energy. And the good news is we have solutions. One that we will talk today is renewable natural gas, or we're talking about today. And there's another one, and it's power to gas hydrogen. And I'm just going to leave you with that at the end of my presentation. Maybe that's the next topic when we speak to you again. So some of the rationale between why Enbridge is participating in this space. So it's an opportunity for us to reduce our environmental footprint. It is an opportunity for us to protect our assets so that they can be used in the future, so we can move clean energy in the future, whether that's RNG or hydrogen. And there is a strategic fit for renewable natural gas in our business. First of all, we have the pipelines, so it's easy to move the molecules around. In terms of commercial risk, it's relatively low, especially when you partner with entities like municipalities, City of Toronto. We're not going anywhere, nor is the city. We're tasked with providing services to Ontario residents. The only thing that we need to figure out is how to come up with this offtake agreement that secures the price of RNG long enough for us to recover our investment. What we're investing in this project is not trivial. And Carlyle will talk a little bit about how many millions of dollars it takes to make this work. And it's okay to make this large of an investment as long as we consider the payback period long enough to make the price per molecule low enough for us to afford. And that's something that I think we figured out in our model, but it's something that needs to be considered as we move forward. In order to attract producers to actually make RNG, we need to find a way to give them the security to make those investments. And bank, financial institutions, everyone is willing to invest in this space. We just need to figure out how to create an offtake agreement, either with municipalities or provinces or utilities, that allow us to make that investment. A little bit about the Canadian marketplace. I think it's important to bring this to your attention. So today, the price for RNG, I think I've put a benchmark of $21 a GJ. In Canada today, you can probably find an off-taker or someone who is willing to buy RNG somewhere between $15 a GJ and $30. Those extremes are actually captured between two provinces, sadly not Ontario. We're working with our regulator to change that, but today that's not quite there. But through voluntary programs or through mandated programs, British Columbia and Quebec both have an RNG purchase program that you can participate in as a producer for up to 20 years. And they will guarantee a price between $15 and $30, depending on the source of that renewable natural gas. It's based on carbon intensity score, and it's defined by characteristics that I will not talk about here today. But if you can ask Tej about this after, he'll explain it in great detail. So another market fundamental, which I think is important to note, and Carlyle will talk about that. This is really how this idea was born originally. Carlyle had a bunch of vehicles, going around picking up green bin waste from residents of Toronto, and they were running on diesel. Those vehicles were coming to the end of its life. And we thought, well, what could we do better than diesel? Is there another technology that we could consider? And our first step into the circular economy model was essentially to look at the vehicles and could the city procure natural gas vehicles today, become 20% cleaner, and by coincidence, also about 40% saved on their energy cost into those vehicles. So it was both cheaper to run the vehicles and 20% environmental impact immediately. But I think the bigger picture was the fact that there was always a vision by City of Toronto and Carlyle that in the future they would produce renewable natural gas, and that renewable natural gas can be used in those vehicles. Doesn't require any infrastructure changes. The vehicles are ready to go. It's a drop-in fuel. So fast forward to 2019 from 2015 when we started this journey, and by January of this year, next year, the City of Toronto will fully be able to implement the circular economy model where the truck picking up your waste runs on the energy created from waste that it picks up. It's quite incredible. It's an achievement, and it does require vision. When we talk about potential, so this is just one potential, and Carlyle will talk about what the city's potential is in terms of how much RNG they can produce. But when you look across Canada, that's 85 BCF of energy per year. Let's just say it's a large number of energy that we can produce. By definition, we think we can displace up to 30% of our fossil fuel with just RNG before we consider any other clean gaseous fuels. So it's considerable. So is this new technology? Absolutely not. If you look at this map, it shows some of the projects that are either developed or in development or currently under construction. 4 of those will be in City of Toronto alone, and in Ontario there are about 10 to 15 projects currently under consideration or in development. So pretty good for 100% renewable fuel. So enablers. This map is pretty busy, so I won't draw your attention to it too much, except that shows all of the North American jurisdictions that are considering a renewable portfolio standard or a way to acquire clean fuels into the energy mix of those provinces and or states. That's the important part. If we are to make headway in any renewable space, we need consistent government policy that allows that long-term investment. What hurts us the most, and I know Tesh talked about cap and trade, what hurts us the most is the fact that with every government change, we potentially face a change in policy. And it's difficult to plan long-term when that policy changes every 4 years, whether that's in our country or south of the border. So when we considered our project, the first project, we were counting on cap and trade money. I believe maybe it might have even arrived for a while in your bank account, although I think it did disappear shortly after election. But we purposely planned to make sure that this project did not rely on funding. We wanted to find a way to make these projects work without any external funding. It certainly helps. It takes the pressure off. It relieves the pressure a little bit. But as long as there is a portfolio standard that mandates us to procure green energy, we will be fine. Funding directly may not be 100% required, although very helpful. So I want to leave you with this last slide. Pretty busy. So last year, Enbridge commissioned a first power to gas facility in Ontario. I'm not sure if that's maybe in Canada. And it's a neat concept. So all of you might have heard that Ontario produces and has a lot of clean electricity. We invested a whackload of money into solar and wind, and that's awesome. However, when the grid doesn't require that electricity, we're forced to do a bunch of things. We either sell it to other jurisdictions, we turn off those solar cells or windmills, or we go external and say, we have a whole bunch of electricity that our grid needs to get rid of right now. Does anyone want it? Does anyone want it for free? Maybe can we pay you to take that electricity? And that hurts because we're paying pretty good dollar for FIT contracts for electricity, 60 to 80 cents a kilowatt hour. When you start giving away that electricity, that's painful. That's painful on us as ratepayers, and it's painful for those facilities because they're not producing revenue. So power to gas is an interesting concept where we're able to take that electricity when the grid doesn't require it. And we talk a lot about storage of electricity. That's probably the key fundamental problem that I think we face in our society today. We can produce a whack load of clean electricity like you talked about in Costa Rica or like we produce here. What we can't do very effectively is store that energy. Chemical storage, battery storage, is challenging at a utility scale. So you can do it for your phone or for your computer pretty well, even for the car. But when we start to store the amount of electricity that is needed to power our society, especially in cold climates such as the one we live in, that becomes challenging. So this is another way that we can offset that challenge. Think of it as, instead of being a chemical form of storage, in this particular case, it's gaseous form of storage. And we know that some of the properties around gas allow us to compress it, allow us to store it in underground caves. We have millions of miles of pipeline. That pipeline can be compressed as well. So if we can find a way, and in this case we have, to take that clean electricity, break water into hydrogen and oxygen, take that hydrogen, either store it in a tank or put it into our distribution system, we now have found a way to take a whack load of electricity and store it. So that either it can be used as a vehicle fuel, it can be mixed into our pipeline, it can be commingled with natural gas or methane, or it can sit there and wait until such time that the grid requires electricity again. And through hydrolysis, I believe the process is called, I'm not an expert in this field, we can then bring that electricity back online and use that stored hydrogen to now feed back into the grid as electrons or electricity. So that's the next step for us. And at 2 megawatt facility, we are proving that it can work. It does carry some challenges, certainly as new technologies do. Most of them are economic because every time we transform that molecule, we lose a little bit of efficiency. And that's somewhat problematic for us because it's not the most efficient way of storing energy. But I bet you if there was some math done on this, it would be relatively comparable to storing that same electricity in a battery after you consider the fact that you need to go and mine those resources. They're difficult to recycle, they're difficult to dispose again. So I think on an energy balance scale, both technologies are relatively comparable. I think that's all I have for now. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, I hope. And as Kris said at the beginning of this, at his introduction, we want this to be a conversation. So we will definitely encourage you to participate and ask as many questions as you can. We're open and we have nothing but transparency. So I hope you'll have lots of questions for us, especially for Tej and Carlyle. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everyone. First of all, as you know by now, my name is Carlyle. I'm the Director of Infrastructure and Resource Management for the City of Toronto Solid Waste Management Program. It's always my pleasure to speak in front of the audience. As Rob alluded to, we wanted to be interactive, ask us questions, stop me, because there were a lot of Carlyle will explain or Carlyle will talk about. These two dropped and I was trying to keep note of it, but the list got too long. So if I missed something, you're not clear about it, by all means, please ask me. So it is my pleasure to be here in front of you and chat a little bit about what we're doing at the city and how things are operating. I would be remiss if I didn't introduce Nadine Kerr and Neil McDonald. They're part of my team directly. Nadine operates the organics facilities on behalf of the City of Toronto. Neil, he builds them. So to some degree, Neil builds them and Nadine breaks them. And we have another team that fixes them. But at the end of the day, it's all good. So I have the honor of trying to put the story together and sharing that with everyone. And I think they purposely put me at the end because when Rob and Tej go before me, it's almost like a one-on-one brush up for me because I forget a lot of things. It has been a long journey, 2015, and we spent many hours on the phone and debating issues back and forth that even my family at 9 o'clock when I'm on the phone, they're like, "Who are you talking to, Dad?" And, "Oh, it's Rob, it's Tej." And they're like, "Oh, okay, we're going to bed." So it's just been one of those journeys, but it's been a real pleasure to be with. And then last but not least, Kris Hornburg, our moderator. I think we all know Kris very well, everyone on the panel. He was the catalyst that really made it real for the city of Toronto. He came in as the Urban Fellows program, and he was actually working under Nadine. So I think she was cracking the whip. And his assignment was to develop a paper within 6 months looking at renewable energies. And out of that, there was probably 8 or 10 different scenarios, and the one that we focused in on was renewable natural gas, because all the pieces of the puzzles were there, and we just simply had to start turning them over and organizing them in a way that actually made sense. And then Kris was the catalyst for that, so I give him a lot of credit for that. And yes, he did work for me, and then he wandered off to greater and better things, but it's always a pleasure to have him around. So I'm going to try and tell you our story. It's going to be very simple. We got the good doctor, we got Rob, and then you got me. As early as October 2nd, which was about a week and a half ago, City Council declared a climate crisis. This was key not only for the City of Toronto, but also for the rest of Canada. We're not the first municipality to do that, by far. There's actually quite a few of them around us, Mississauga, Burlington, those I know that have declared it. But we do have the honor and the privilege of being on one of the largest stage. So the Toronto Sun, the Star, the Globe and Mail, when we do things like this, they pick it up a little bit more readily than anyone else. So this climate crisis really declared by City Council is an emergency. That also allows us to derive resources and people and the power of the city behind what can we do. And you know, you can go research a little bit about this. You can look at Transform TO, which is our strategy and how to get there. But what we've been working on since 2015 is a real call to action. That's something I'm very proud of, because it's all come together in a momentous way. And it is a call to action. We've actually been doing something, and it will have a real impact. And I have a daughter who's 15 right now, but 4 or 5 years ago when we started this, she was just becoming a teenager, and it was, how do you explain to people how significant this is, and why do we do the things that we do? And it really is about that 4-degree planet. We talk about climate change and getting down to 1.5 if we're lucky. And I really underscore if we're lucky. This morning we had the privilege too of hearing 2 young ladies speak, and they were almost the champions and steward of the environment. They were telling us what we should be doing as adults. Everyone in this room, after our question and answer period, I hope you become ambassadors for what we're talking about today. You talk about wind, you talk about solar, you talk about electricity. Names like Bill Gates, Richard Branson, Elon Musk, they pop up. Talk about RNG, which is a viable source of renewable energy. Nobody's talking about it. And I don't get it. We all eat. We all have food waste. Why isn't anyone talking about this? And who's our champion? Well, I'm going to ask everyone in this room to start becoming that champion. Start being that ambassador. Refer to Enbridge, refer to the City of Toronto. Call Kris, make those calls, make it happen. Keep it a little bit more relevant, and Kris is probably going to give me the hook sooner than later. Food waste. We talk about zero waste, closed loops, and we'll get into that a little bit. But as long as we're eating and as long as we're consuming food, food is an energy source. Can we take that food in a very simple way, pre-process it, put it through an AD facility and generate biogas? Then we can then produce RNG, renewable natural gas. By all means, we can do that type of stuff. So that's what this is all about. Some key points. Solid waste has a renewable source of energy. That's the food waste that I'm talking about. Not only can we do it in the City of Toronto, but Montreal can do it. Calgary can do it. Kelowna, BC can do it. Memphis. Anywhere where there's a population that's large enough, I think the magic number is between 20 to 25,000 tons of organic material, you can do this. So we're more than happy to share our story and take out some of those speed bumps that we hit along the way. And, working with folks like Enbridge and working with folks like GHD, they make the journey simple. But we can speak to it from a real hands-on, kind of where the rubber hit the pavement, not to use those type of analogies, I probably shouldn't. But we can help with that story. Biogas and landfill gas can be easily converted to renewable energy. and they have a significant environmental, social, and economic benefit. We always take a triple bottom line lens when we make our decisions. It cannot strictly be financial. There has to be a social and environmental lens to it. And we hold each other there to that. The Disco Road Organics Processing Facility, this is a 75,000 ton facility just located to the east of the airport. As you drive by on 427, you can see it's big, it's round, it's shiny. It was a picture that Ted was pointing to. That's 75,000 tons of food waste. The Dufferin Organics Processing Facility, the one that I'm going to talk about a little bit more, is 55,000 tons. So combined, we're managing 130,000 tons of organic waste. They're processing 130,000 tons. We're actually collecting 188,000 tons. So I need one more plant. Council, stakeholders, residents, I need to build a third ED facility. So that's kind of what's going on right now. As we get to things like organic bans and people become more aware of the good news story and they start to participate more in the green bin program, that 188,000 tons is only going to go up. It won't go down. Renewable natural gas can lead to alternative sources of revenue for the solid waste management division. Obviously, when I talk about the triple bottom line, we're looking at what are the beneficial uses that we can have for the renewable natural gas. We can put it into our trucks, and then we'll talk about that in a few minutes. It's a 5 to 10% blend. That truck that's picking up the organic waste is running on renewable natural gas. In addition, when we talked about cap and trade, or we looked at large emitters that are looking to come down or lower the carbon intensity of their emissions, they can burn or use a green fuel to get there. So there's an opportunity there. Renewable natural gas can potentially benefit the city as a whole, without a doubt. Right now, we're focused in on solid waste, which is kind of nice because we get to go and make all the mistakes and learn by it. Then we get to apply it to Toronto Water. We apply it to the TTC, facilities, whoever's listening to us. Maybe it's the heater that runs the rec center for the swimming pools. However, we want to green our activities as a municipality. That's a strategy that we can develop and work into our path forward. So what is this closed loop approach that we talk about? The first bullet there, the number one, the organic waste is put into the green bin. I think we're all familiar with the green bin program. We see photos of it. We see the trucks. The collection trucks, they go by, they pick up this material, they kind of pop it in. It's really sexy. The little kids like it. It's a lot of fun. Goes to our AD facility, anaerobic digestion, where it's pre-processed. We get rid of all the things that shouldn't be there. We get rid of all the impurities in terms of, a fork or broken plate that somehow gets mixed into it. It's then it then goes into the digester, where it's kept for about 12 to 21 days typically, and it produces biogas. At the Dufferin Organics Processing Facility, we're processing 55,000 tons of organic material annually, and we'll produce about 3.6 million cubic meters of biogas. 3.6 million cubic meters of biogas can be upgraded and cleaned to about 3.2, 3.3 million cubic meters of RNG. And lo and behold, that's kind of the, now that we have all this gas, what do we do with it? So then we looked at Enbridge, and it's a really simple concept, and it's one that I use time and time again. But I went to Enbridge, and Kris and I were kind of the champions of this one. And we sat down with Rob and his counterpart, actually Millard McPherson. And we said to them, we work in Toronto, and we can go to the nearest bank machine and deposit $20. I live in Oakville. I can go to Oakville, go to the nearest bank machine, and withdraw $20. Can I do that with a cubic meter of gas? I can produce the renewable natural gas at Disco or Dufferin, and then I can take it out wherever my trucks are, because my trucks aren't necessary at my facilities. And they went away and they thought about it, and they came back and said, hey, you know what, we can do that. And it's so easy to do. Let us help you. And without a doubt, Enbridge stepped up. We had another challenge, is how do we make sure our gas is pure enough that we don't contaminate the distribution grid. Compressed natural gas is very pure, I guess is the term. So Enbridge, once again, they stepped up. They said, you know what, we'll take that risk. We'll design the facility for you. We'll clean your gas for you, and we will inject it into the grid and move it from point A to point B. You just tell me where you want to take it, and we'll do it for you. I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. So that's kind of the partnership piece of it that we got into, and it was the common understanding, it was the communication. once again, the keynote speaker in the morning. He was kind of lending himself to that. And I think that partnership is so important in making any project successful. I don't care if it's an RNG facility or if it's, you're trying to build a bridge to connect two sides of the shore. It's the partnership and the people who make the difference. So going back to my graphic here, number 4, we've taken the biogas, we've cleaned it up. We have 3.2 million cubic meters of RNG. We can now put it into the pipeline. From there, we can use it in our trucks. We can use it to produce power. We can use it to heat your homes. We can use it in boilers. You've heard all about that. And then the loop closes. What's really, really significant here is at Dufferin, we will be closing the carbon loop. They get that right, Kris? You told me that last week. So what's key there is we're closing the carbon loop. 9,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. That's what we're closing. So we're getting immediately the benefit from our operations. So that's 9,000 tons per year carbon dioxide. So if you were to imagine or think how much space or volume carbon dioxide, which is approximately close to here, I guess. Yeah, how much space that will take, it's significant when you talk about the atmosphere. And every year we'll bank another 9,000, and we'll go on for as long as we run this plant. The other additional benefit, if there's an offtake that somebody else can use this renewable natural gas, they too are displacing fossil fuels. And that could be compressed natural gas, that could be coal. But what we're doing at Dufferin is going to take about 1,800 cars off the road. That's equivalent. I think it was 4.5 CN towers was full of waste. That was the other number. But these are really big numbers, and it's hard to wrap your mind around it. So graphics at the end, you're going to see, they're going to help you understand it a little bit better. So those of you who are a little bit more techie, this is how the material is processed. It goes into the green bin. From there, it goes to our facility where it's dropped on a tip floor. In the city of Toronto, we invested in the organic strategy way back in the early 2000s. We wanted to take what they call the yuck factor out, so we accept plastic bags in our green bins. We have processes that can separate the plastic from the organic material. We use pulpers, we use presses, what have you. The third picture there is the pulper. Basically, you think of a blender and you put the plastic bag with all the good organic material in it. You hit the blender switch and away it goes, it pulps it up. Heavies settle out, plastics float to the top. We can skim off the plastics, the heavies, batteries, whatever it is. We then take that away. And the nice, clean, rich pulp is what we feed into the digesters. Those 2 silver tanks that you see here. This is the Disco Road Organics Processing Facility. Out of that, we get 3 streams. We've got a solid stream, we get a liquid stream, and we also get a gaseous stream. This is the gas that we're using to clean up. I'm going to pick it up a little bit so that there's time for questions, because I know everyone's just dying to ask a question or two. The Dufferin Organics Processing Facility, correct me if I'm wrong, Neil, I think it was about $74 million to build. The RNG will be about 20 million. The Disco Road was in the same ballpark to build. Dufferin was a retrofit from an existing pilot plant that we had. The Disco Road, I think, once again, is $15 to $20 million for the RNG. But we have a buyback, which is the crazy part of it. If you look at the financial side, which my boss and everyone else likes, I think the return on investment is less than 7 years. And that is at today's market price. So you introduce cap and trade, you ban organics, you take real action against climate change, that price is just going to go up. So right now we're seeing about $30 at the top end. We think it's going to go to probably 50. But the residents and people who are participating in the green bin program, they're going to benefit from it. The more you put into the green bin and the more you divert from landfill, which is ultimately our goal right now, and being stewards of the environment, you're going to receive the benefit from it. We're not taking it, we're not siphoning it off, we're not doing any crazy stuff, we're returning that benefit to the public. So there's a huge social component there that we can speak of. Production numbers, just so that folks know, Disco, Dufferin, Keel Valley, which is a former landfill that we run, 4,000 CFMs, cubic feet per minute coming off of Keel Valley, and then Green Lane. All in all, I can produce 60 million cubic meters of renewable natural gas. So that's a lot of energy. For those who like gigajoules, I can tell you Dufferin, we're producing 3.2 million cubic meters of RNG, and that's about 130 gigajoules of energy. So do the math, figure out what 60 is. Last but not least, these are some conversion numbers. This is the equivalent in terms of RNG, 8,000 pounds of coal being burnt, emissions, cars, vehicles, these are all kind of stuff that we have. And I guess finally is our contact information. We'll leave that up there while we get to the question and answer period. I'll hand the mic back to Kris so that he can walk us through that. And don't forget to have folks out there. We can move the mics to around. You figure it out.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I had taken some questions down, but I'd rather just open it up to the audience first to see if there's any burning questions, rather get to your questions first. So anybody, and yeah, so we also have some cue cards. So if you want to ask your questions by cue card, in case you don't want to speak up, more than welcome to just, but if you want to just ask questions that way, that's fine too. Want to go first?
Am I talking about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious whether anybody, yourselves or others that you know of, is doing research into how to make this on a smaller scale, so that you could have them, say, in rural areas dealing with agricultural waste, running cogen systems, rather than always like having it in data.
Yeah, I'll start first. I'll use the mic. I'll pass it over to Tej. I know one of the technologies providers for the Disco Road, they're working on a small scale package plant. That's the term they use. It fits in a Sealand container, and they're looking at small communities such as the Brickworks to put that there, but there's a lot of recognition there. And then Rob also talked about, instead of extending the pipe where you have communities, they would need a solution that's a little bit smaller. I don't know if either one of you gentlemen want to add?
Yeah, maybe just one word on that. So in Ontario, we have a lot of agricultural zones, and those areas, whether they're milk farms or beef producing cows, they all generate a considerable amount of organic waste. And we are looking at those facilities, so farm-based ADs, and how we can capture that energy and then move it into our pipeline. Something we didn't talk about at length, but one of the challenges in those remote communities is to find a way to take that gas away from that location. A lot of them are remote, they're not connected to communities, and they're usually not served by a pipeline. So what we are also working on behind the scenes that we didn't talk about today is creating a rubber pipeline, essentially pulling up a truck to the back of one of those facilities, compressing the gas onto a trailer, and having the ability to move it to a location where we can inject it into our distribution system. That's also very viable and something we may consider when we look at some of the landfills that are more remote.
So on the small scale systems, if you look at the farms, and again, as Rob noted, the agricultural community in Ontario, I think there's about 35 agricultural anaerobic digesters sitting on farms in Ontario. So we actually have quite a high concentration of those smaller farm-based ones that are treating things like dairy manure and other manures, but they're also bringing in food waste as well to co-digest with the manure. That's actually fairly common. There are issues of scale. Carlyle already mentioned sort of a number of tons that sort of make this viable from the food waste standpoint. No one's really gotten to the point yet of making that sort of, appliance-based anaerobic digester for residential homes. I mean, some of you guys are students out there. Maybe one of you guys can invent one of these things, but that might be an ultimate goal, I guess, somewhere down the road. But we're not down to that scale yet. But certainly for the farms, 500 cattle on your farm, can you make a digester for that? Yes, and there are lots of examples of that. The city and the infrastructure they've built, I would call the big scale. That's the big industrial scale that really needs to treat a lot of food waste.
So the next question was, can you use sewage sludge to create RNG?
I'll take that.
Take it.
Yeah. Without a doubt, at the City of Toronto, I know Toronto Water, we work very closely with them, and they're looking at what we're doing and the success of our project. Right now, they do have CHP, combined heat and power, and they're using it to offset the electrical demands at the wastewater and the drinking water treatment plants. But ultimately, once you start looking at, let's say, the optimal use of it, I think it will shift a little bit. And as more and more of these projects come online, it'll be easier for them to adopt. But we are the first within the city to go down that path, which is fair. And that's how we manage risk. So it's a good thing, and it is happening. There are some communities in Ontario, Stratford, Rob and Tej are both involved in that, where they're looking at producing RNG from wastewater. So
I should also mention, we didn't talk about this here today, but through NGIF, which is Natural Gas Innovation Fund, we're also exploring technologies where we're able to take hydrogen and use hydrogen as a catalyst for breaking down molecules that are organic or plastic and producing syngas or synthetic gas. I won't even attempt to explain how that happens, except it has been done at bench scale. It is being proven at small utility scale, kind of like our power to gas facility, and there are a lot of academics involved in this. I think Tej might share a little bit of a glimpse into the future. That's the groundbreaking opportunity that we're all looking forward to. We mentioned how we can make hydrogen relatively consistently through renewable sources. Now that hydrogen, it can play in this entire picture, whereby it is used as a way of producing recycled natural gas. It's still RNG, it's not renewable, but it is recycled. And one of the biggest challenges Tej mentioned was, how do we deal with plastics? We use plastics for everything. How do we deal with that? Hydrogen has a play, and it's an interesting concept that we are definitely following very closely.
Yeah, so to follow up with that, I think if we look into the future, 5 years from now, I'll say 5 years, so I'm going to prognosticate, and I'll probably be wrong, but I'll do my best. I think we will be living in much more of what I would call a hydrogen economy in Canada. I think we've already seen other parts of the world move in that direction. Japan, for instance, has a number of vehicles on the road that run on fuel cells, which means they need hydrogen. So we are seeing a push. The federal government has talked a lot about that, about moving towards hydrogen. Enbridge is already engaged in a project to produce hydrogen from water. So I think we are tending and heading in that direction. The University of Waterloo has a really interesting research project that they're engaged in right now that we're helping with. They're trying to take organic waste and convert it directly into hydrogen, which is a very, very interesting sort of process. It's a biological process. All the energy we're talking about here is biological. So this is directly organic waste to hydrogen as part of that hydrogen economy. So I think things like that are happening right now. Just back to the sewage sludge question. So there's only one plant right now in Ontario that has a renewable natural gas facility at a wastewater treatment plant, but there is one, and that's the city of Hamilton. They have one of these systems already, and it's been running for, I think, almost 4 or 5 years now. Yeah, so it's there. It can be done. It's really interesting, though. The amount of gas that you can generate off sewage sludge is a fair bit less than the amount of gas you can generate off food waste. So if you really want to move the needle and produce RNG, tackle the food waste, obviously pay attention to the sewage sludge. The city of Stratford that Carlyle mentioned is doing a really interesting thing. They're going to actually bring in food waste to their wastewater treatment plant digesters and process that material and put it into their digesters and make RNG. So in some cases, the food waste world and the wastewater treatment world is converging.
Okay, so the next question is for Tej, but obviously the panel can jump in. Do you think carbon tax should be mandatory? And what are your thoughts on governmental policy on that aspect?
I'm not a politician, Kris.
That's okay. This is not me asking. It's
I can't believe you asked that. I don't know if it's the best instrument. I actually kind of liked, personally, I like the cap and trade mechanism. So when you look at this, there's two mechanisms. You can create a carbon tax, which basically is a tax on fuels, gasoline, diesel, even natural gas. And you can take those proceeds and use it to build green infrastructure, or you can go down the cap and trade route. I think we were all in Ontario very excited, I think, when cap and trade was here. It was a real motivating influence for people to build the infrastructure. It was pretty straightforward. As you saw in the figure I put up, it's not hard to understand, and it is effective. It does work, and it has worked in lots of other places. So I like that system, having never really lived in a system with a carbon tax or fully understanding what that would actually achieve. I don't know if it's better or not, but there has to be something. I think that's the point here. There has to be some kind of regulatory push from someone for people to do a lot of this, because, when we're talking about diverting food waste from a landfill, and I'll say this very plainly, the cheapest thing you can do with the food waste, if you really want to just make it go away, is put it in the landfill. So why would you do something else? There has to be a reason for that. I would say the city of Toronto, as a leader in this, chose to do this in the absence of real regulation. They just thought it was the right thing to do, and they've championed it. But how do you get everyone else to do it? What motivates everyone else to do it? Well, I think you need some kind of driver there from a regulatory standpoint. I talked about organics bans. They're coming. They're across the country now and in the States and various places. That motivates this material for moving out as well. So that's another kind of regulatory driver. So there has to be something. I think the governments honestly have to take some action to promote something better happening with respect to this part of the climate change file.
I'd like to add one more thing to that. So the impacts of either cap and trade or carbon tax, we have felt that in Ontario, I think, for a couple of years. So cap and trade added about 4 cents per MQ to your heating costs at home. That was the cap and trade penalty, if you will, or contribution by society into this. And carbon tax at $25 a ton is about 3.3 cents per MQ, roughly the same for gasoline or diesel. And when you think about that in practical terms for the city of Toronto, every molecule that they generate from renewable source, they can now pump that back into their own consumption. And as a result, there is a saving to the city of that same amount in terms of how much additional revenue that contributes or how much avoided cost that contributes to their tax burden. So in both cases, I think those policies do work, and they do encourage us to find solutions that are using less fossil fuel.
Very quickly, I know we're probably pressed for time, and I know there's more questions. But when we made the decision to pursue the RNG strategy, like Tej and Kris have indicated, it was the right thing to do. And we truly believe that we could offset, move from diesel to a low carbon emitting vehicle, Class 7, Class 8 trucks that were 40% better in terms of emissions. Or was that the cost? Sorry, the cost was 40% better. The emissions was 20% better. So doing the right thing is sometimes takes a little bit of courage and a little bit of luck. I think for me, it was more luck, but we did it. And I think it's, hopefully we'll get the backdrop legislation that we need to support these success stories. I think, Neil, you had your hand up there?
I just had a comment for the good doctor.
The good doctor.
Followed by a question. So, and it's building off what you said, that doing the right thing. So really, the objective is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon tax, cap and trade, two sides of one coin. There are both ways to put a price to something that's otherwise free. And thereby use the forces of economics to manage that. Regulatory tax, people feel bad and impose when the word tax is used. Cap and trade mobilizes the interests of companies to manage that level of emissions. So that's the commentary. Now the question for the doctor. His comment was somewhat to the effect that Ontario is singular in the world of cap and trade after recent abandonment of that. Are there other Canadian jurisdictions where cap and trade is functioning now?
Yes, there are. So Quebec is party to a system, and so is British Columbia, but probably the most interesting jurisdiction is probably Alberta. So Alberta has something called, it was called the Specified Gas Emitters Regulation, and that has been on the book since 2007. And that is a form of a cap and trade system. There are carbon credits being created in Alberta by people who are implementing infrastructure to reduce emissions. And those credits are being sold to the obviously very heavy carbon intensive industries that are out in Alberta. So it's a different system. It's an intensity-based system rather than what Ontario was proposing, but it's sort of the same model.
Okay, so building on that, there are other jurisdictions in Canada where variations of cap and trade are working. I believe there are also other jurisdictions in North America. Can you comment on the compatibility of credits between those jurisdictions?
Yes, I can. So there is when you look at all these regional carbon systems, there is a linkage between some of them. They need a common platform that understands what each of these credits really means. The one linkage that was going to be in place for Ontario to bind us to basically California and Quebec was called the Western Climate Initiative. And that was really a way to make those systems compatible so you could notionally transact credits created in Ontario to someone who needs them in California. Again, under the premise that it doesn't matter where the emission reduction is occurring, just that it is occurring. So obviously, Ontario is backed out of that system now. The Alberta system that I mentioned would not be compatible with those other systems because they account for carbon in a very different way than these other systems are proposed. I think, looking ahead, I think kind of what I wish would happen is that the federal government in Canada came up with a federal program for carbon that was consistent across the country, because what we're really seeing right now is various provinces either doing something or doing almost nothing. And these systems are not necessarily compatible because they are regional rather than sort of created at the federal level, where it probably would have more impact and create less issues with compatibility of how these systems work across the country and even carbon pricing.
Sorry, I just want to get to one more question here, and then I'll see you there. This one's for Carlyle. When will the circular economy model be fully implemented in the city of Toronto? So that includes trucks fueled by waste. And will it only be applied to waste collection trucks, or are you also looking at other sectors within the city?
The when and being precise is probably a difficult question to answer. I know that in March, we will be producing renewable natural gas and blending that in with compressed natural gas and fueling our fleet. So Solid Waste Management has made the commitment to move 100% of its collection vehicles, the Class 7, Class 8 vehicles, over to renewable natural gas. We're actually going this fall to council with a recommendation as to what that blend should be. Success is contagious. So while people think about things or they complain about why you shouldn't be doing stuff or we've tried it before, we just quietly go along and be successful, and it becomes contagious. So I think the other cities, I know Toronto Water, we have really strong hooks and connections with our cousins, our friends in Toronto Water. I know the EED, the Environment and Energy Office, they're definitely looking at what we're doing and showcasing that. We talked about the money. We got $10 million for the project just before the provincial election, and poof, yes, it disappeared. But we didn't make our business case on funding or regulation or anything else. We knew that we had a stream of material called organic material to manage on behalf of the residents and stakeholders of the city. We knew it was the right thing to do. We knew getting our trucks off diesel and on compressed natural gas would get us that benefit environmentally. And we also recognized back then that there is a climate crisis, and anyone that says differently, like Tej said, the science is there. It's now just a matter of putting the mark in the history book that the science is there. So I don't know if I fully answered the question, but keep asking the questions because it forces the other divisions to take note of it, right? There's a question in the back there. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Congratulations to the city for, we toured all your facilities about four years ago. We saw the flares, and it's great to see that those flares are going to go now going to the trucks. I'm from London, and so we also toured the Green Lane landfill south of the city. And we heard this morning about justice, about environmental justice and social justice. A bunch of social scientists in the group at the conference here, and I'm wondering if this is a real opportunity for addressing environmental social justice issues. And that Green Lane is right next to a large Indigenous community. You know this, of course. We also know that there's ways to just redistribute things. And have you thought about what that might look like into the future? Is it dollars flowing directly as impact benefit agreements, or maybe fuel?
So as I unfold my answer and tell you, this question was not planted. We do operate a landfill out in this outskirts of London. It's the Green Lane landfill. Kris and I and then the senior management team, we've been just discussing kind of to end on the positive things that we can do. And while there's a revenue agreement that is in existence and has to be renewed after a certain period, we are holding ourselves to the task of what can we do better and more. Because I can write a check and then go away and say, "That a boy." If the issue is drinking water, we at the city, we have the resources to write a tender, a plant specification to treat the water. If the issue is roads, bridges, whatever, we have the ability to do that and using the revenue for it. So we don't want to just, the commitment right now is not just to write a check or a revenue stream. We have the ability to leverage the knowledge and the expertise within the city that can be applied locally. And we are going around that, oops, that's probably the cue. We're going to go around that way with regards to social and environmental justice. But that was actually one of the theses that Kris wrote. So you may want to add a couple more things to it. And
I'm happy to chat with you offline after. I just want to make sure we get to as many questions as possible.
Yep.
And I apologize in advance. I won't be able to ask all of these, but there are a lot of great ones up here. So I encourage you to come across the panel myself after, because we'd be happy to chat with about these. So one interesting one, and it's very topical right now given the election, but do microplastics affect the RNG process? Do you know?
I have no idea.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
I don't think so. I mean, you've got a gaseous product that's created in a big tank full of liquid in the anaerobic digester environment, and then the gas kind of is pulled away from that environment and it's going through a very, very sophisticated system of cleanup. So that's a great question. I don't think anyone's necessarily studied that, and I don't know the answer. Haven't heard that one come up before.
Yeah. Okay, and I'll end on this one because I think we're right at the time limit anyway. And Rob, this question's for you. Good luck.
good luck.
What is the company's overall thoughts with regard to the pipeline, with regards to pipeline projects in terms of replacement, climate activities, and the relation to Indigenous people and their reactions? If that's, Sarah, sorry, I haven't been reading it.
I was doing my research on the recent Enbridge pipeline that's been replaced line 3. It's been going on back and forth like in terms of regulation. So I just want to understand, because today was the first time I learned that there's renewable gas project as well for Enbridge, because I think so on the other side of it. So I just want to understand, how do you deal with the heat from this end, and then there is clean fuel happening on the other side. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and as you're asking it, I'm trying to figure out exactly what qualifications I have to answer that. So I'm on the business development of the renewable side of our company, so I may not be the best person to answer the question, although I can definitely put you in touch with someone that can. I'll tell you this, from my perspective, delivering reliable, resilient energy to Ontario through the gaseous system is something that we've been focused on as the gas utility. Enbridge Inc. is a company that moves all sources of energy, including liquids or oil. And those are the ones that are usually in the media from the Indigenous community side of things, or going through certain sections of land and what that may potentially mean to the environment. So it's something that we're very mindful of. And, as a Canadian generally, what we always hear in the news debated is, does it make sense to connect our coastlines with our natural resources, whether that's gas or oil? Today, we only have one outlet for our oil, and that's to go south to US. They buy it at $25 per barrel discount. So they have a little bit of a locked audience in Canada, because we don't have a good way to deliver our oil somewhere else. So that's something that I contemplate just as a resident of this country. But it's a right debate to have, and we should certainly explore that further. I'm not the person that probably is the best to answer the question. I'm sorry.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
So I won't be adding to your question specifically, but one of the things that we as a team, all three of us, 4 of us, we don't shy away from kind of the tough questions. And I did get that question a number of times, is you guys are partnering with Enbridge. Did you know that? Well, ultimately, as we move forward, if history is going to dictate how I move forward, I'll never get any better. So Enbridge has committed to us to green the pipeline in Ontario. They joined with Union Gas I can now move my green molecule anywhere in North America. That's significant. And they're showing us how. So I think as we move forward, we are looking for those hard, tough questions, and we're trying to come back with a positive response on how to address it. These things take effort. These things take time. The question that came out of our colleagues from London is social justice. It is something that is on our mind. I've been out to Greenland so many times, and I come back and I'm just, angry because we could do so much more.
Okay, with that, that's kind of the end of the panel. So please join me in a big welcome. And again, we'll be here for a little while still. So if you have any questions, please feel free to come ask anytime. Thanks so much.